7 days ago, we squished a lot of bugs and made resources that can explode. This week, the bugs fight back. In the last video, a comment was left by user DevLog I, saying it would be fun to have the swarmlings have the ability to pile on the player and slow them down. I really liked the idea of giving the swarmlings more of a purpose than just being something to squish, and the idea of having the swarmlings pile on the player sounded like a really fun mechanic. So special thanks to DevLog I for the idea of what to work on this week. The first thing I did was to start to plan out on paper what would be needed for the swarmlings to slow down the player. Since I'm already using the enemy manager, where I was calling the slam function, I felt like this would be the best place to add this new attack. I knew I was going to use a few things from the slam function, including disabling the nav mesh, enemy eye script, and spawning a particle. So I copied them over from the function and renamed the variables to things related to slowing. When it came to how to slow the player, to affect the player's speed I have to adjust a speed variable inside the third-person controller script. Originally, I tried accessing and changing the values from inside the slow function, calling the player's move speed and subtracting a value every time a swarmling would collide with the player. After it was added in and I hit play, the swarmling started to drift to the sky as if they had no gravity. While a swarm of little bugs in the sky is both amusing and terrifying, it was not the desired result, so I went back into the script. The only way the swarmlings could drift off the ground is from their nav mesh being disabled and not re-enabled. I tried a few different ways of doing this, between using a coroutine and also just toggling off and on in the same function. In the end, I ended up creating a new function that would get called after the particle got spawned. Inside of this function, it would turn the nav mesh and enemy eye script back on, as well as destroy the swarmling and the particle system. I chose to go this way, since the swarmling was going to die once the player shook them off anyways, so it didn't make a lot of sense to still have the game object active. There needed to be a visual for the swarmling being on the player and slowing them down, and also a way to shake them off. So to make the swarmlings attack the player, I chose to do it in a way similar to how I update the aura under the player's hand. Inside of the player prefab, I added a bunch of empty game objects, all with sprite renderers, and placed them around the player. Inside of the script, I made a public game object as an array to house all of the objects that have the sprite renderers, and a public sprite for the sprite of the swarmling. The reason I chose to go with game objects for the array instead of directly the sprite renderers is that I wanted to use both the renderer and the transform of the object without having to call separate variables. Once I had the array filled out, I added a function called hitBySwarmling. Inside of the function, it takes an integer I named hitBySwarmling and checks that it's currently less than the length of the array of game objects. If it is, it then adds one to the hitBySwarmling integer and subtracts the slow speed from the player's move speed. It then grabs their sprite renderer off the game object in the array by using the hitBySwarmling integer as the place in the array to look, and changes the sprite to the swarmling. This actually works pretty well, but I had made a wall of each game object and copied them over, so it was making the swarmlings attached to the player way too evenly. So I moved them around for a bit to make it look more random, though I suppose I could have actually just done this in code. I also wanted to give the swarmlings on the player a bit of an animation, so they were not just so static. When I went to make the animation, I ran into a problem. The billboard script that allows the sprites to be visible from all angles was actually overriding any rotation I tried to give the sprite. To solve this, I needed to give a parent object to all of the empty sprite renderers. I chose to make a prefab of the new empty object and put the sprite renderer inside that as a child, and then deleted all the renderers on the player. Afterwards, I made a bunch of copies of the prefab and moved them all over. To let the player shake off the swarmlings, I needed to add a new action to the action map. So I added what was needed to the script where it was calling all the inputs, and then added an if statement in the update method in the combat script to check if the input was activated. If so, it starts the function I named swarmling off. Inside of the swarmling off function, it checks if the player has inputted the button 3 times, and if so, it runs a for each loop checking for all the swarmling sprites and setting them to empty. It then resets the player's move speed back to the speed stored at the start, and spawns in a particle effect for them being shaken off. This worked pretty well, but still needed a few things. One was an animation for the player shaking off the swarmling. For now, the animation just stretches the player a little bit every time they shake off the bugs to help give a bit more of an impact. The other thing I wanted to add was a way for the swarmlings to also affect the player's jump speed. That was as simple as copying the way it was slowing the player, but changing it to add the value instead of subtract. Since the swarmlings are inside of egg sacs in the environment, I chose to make some quick replacement art for the eggs in the scene, as those are more of an egg and not a sac. I also made some fairly quick animations to give the egg sac a bit more life. Then, inside of the egg health script, I added triggers for the bulls in the animator, as well as a collision check for the player to smash the eggs. I chose to make a new ground plane inside of Blender. To make a basic ground plane, I added a plane to the scene in Blender and scaled it fairly large. I then went into edit mode and subdivided the surfaces a few times until I had smaller squares. Using the proportional editing tool, I just grabbed a few random places on the mesh of the plane and pulled it up on the z-axis. For texturing the ground, I tried a few things. Last week, I had been added to the DALL-E 2 beta and I heard online that you could use the program to make unique textures. So I spent a few credits spawning different textures using words like alien planet and alien dirt blue. After I had a few I thought would be cool, I tried doing a few different tricks I had read about how to make them seamless. Unfortunately, in the end, I was unable to figure out how to get the textures to be seamless, and so after a few hours, I decided to move on to using a pre-made seamless texture. After bringing it into the scene, the light was reflecting on it very strongly. To adjust this, I had to mess with the material and also the lighting. This is my first time using the HDRP, and getting the lighting right has been a bit of a challenge. For now, I decided the surface to be dark on the planet, with the only real light sources coming off the player and the different elements in the environment. I ended up putting 4 lights around the player and disabling the volumetrics and shadows so that way the sprite could stay lit all the way around. I also spent some time just fooling around in Blender getting an idea for objects to have in the world. None of these will probably actually end up in the game though. This week was really fun getting the swarmlings to stick to the player and fooling around with modeling for a bit. I think the next thing to focus on is probably getting a few more of the crafting objects scripted.